More than 1 billion cattle are alive on the planet at this exact moment, every single one of them being raised toward the same eventual end. Somewhere north of 9 billion chickens get processed for meat in the United States alone every single year. Pigs, sheep, goats, rabbits, farm deer, entire continent spanning industries built around animals that spend their whole lives eating grass, grain, and hay. Now try to remember the last time a restaurant menu offered you grizzly bear, or timber wolf, or golden eagle, or great white shark outside of some black market fin dish you already knew better than to order. Humans have hunted, herded, and eaten almost every plant-eating animal on this planet at some point in history. But predators? Barely ever. Not as an industry, not as a staple, not even as a habit. Across cultures that never once made contact with each other. No shared language, no shared trade routes, no shared religion. People arrived at the exact same unspoken rule completely independently. Eat the grazers. Leave the hunters alone. Stop and actually sit with that fact for a second, because it is genuinely strange when you say it out loud. A wolf and a cow are both just meat in the end. Both muscle, fat, and protein. Both perfectly edible in theory. So why does one turn up on dinner tables across the entire planet, while the other almost never does? Most people who have ever thought about this at all tend to land on the same lazy explanation and stop there. Predators are dangerous to hunt, so naturally we left them alone. That answer feels reasonable, right up until you remember that humans have hunted grizzly bears, wolves, and orcas for centuries, sometimes at real personal risk, purely for hides, trophies, or territory disputes, without ever once turning the meat into a genuine food source afterward. Danger clearly was not the deciding factor, since it never stopped hunters from killing plenty of predators for reasons that had nothing to do with dinner. Something else was quietly doing the actual work of keeping predator meat off the table, and it turns out to be a lot more interesting and a lot more consistent than simple fear. If puzzles like that one are the reason you keep ending up on this channel, subscribing just means the next one arrives without you having to go looking for it. The answer was never going to be one single tidy reason. It is biology, chemistry, and culture. Three completely separate forces that developed independently of each other across thousands of years and thousands of miles, all stacking on top of each other and all pointing toward the exact same conclusion. Start with the math, because the math alone does most of the heavy lifting here. Back in 1942, an ecologist named Raymond Lindeman worked out something researchers now refer to as the 10% rule. At every step up a food chain, roughly 90% of available energy simply disappears. Burned off as body heat, spent chasing down the next meal, lost during digestion. Only about 10% of it actually survives the climb to the next level up. Picture a meadow producing 100 pounds worth of plant energy in a season. That meadow can support maybe 10 pounds of deer, and that 10 pounds of deer can support roughly 1 pound of wolf. To raise a single pound of predator, you need 10 pounds of prey underneath it. And that 10 pounds of prey needed 100 pounds of plant matter underneath that. Predators are, by simple mathematical design, the single most expensive meat on the planet to produce. Farming lions for food would essentially mean farming an animal whose entire diet is other farmed animals, stacked 2 levels deep. The math never once worked in favor of it. Raising an ordinary cow to slaughter weight already burns through years of grain, water, and pasture land most people never stop to think about. Raising a predator large enough to be worth butchering would mean raising and losing roughly 10 times that amount of prey animal just to keep one carnivore alive long enough to reach size. No society in recorded history has ever had that kind of energy surplus lying around to burn on a single food source. Compare that to chicken, which sits about as low on the food chain as a farmed animal can sit, converting feed into body mass with remarkable efficiency precisely because it skips several of those wasteful energy transfers entirely. That single difference in trophic position is a large part of why chicken is inexpensive enough to eat several times a week, while a genuine apex predator would sit so far up the same ladder that a comparable meal would need to draw on an almost unthinkable quantity of prey animals underneath it, each one of which needed its own mountain of plant matter just to exist in the first place. There is a second, quieter problem underneath the cost issue, one that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with what slowly accumulates inside predator flesh over a lifetime. It is called biomagnification. Environmental toxins, mercury, lead, industrial runoff, do not vanish as they move up a food chain. They concentrate. A small fish absorbs a faint trace of mercury from its surroundings. A larger fish eats hundreds of those small fish and absorbs all of that mercury at once, all in a single body. A shark eats hundreds of those larger fish and absorbs even more on top of that. By the time you reach the very top of a food chain, you are looking at an animal that has spent its entire life quietly warehousing everyone else's pollution. This is precisely why doctors advise pregnant women against eating shark, swordfish, or king mackerel. Not because those fish are inherently unhealthy, but because each one sits at the top of a chain that has been silently collecting toxins for years on end, absorbing a little more from every smaller fish it has ever swallowed over the course of its life. The same brutal pattern very nearly erased bald eagles from the map during the 20th century. The pesticide, known as DDT, washed into rivers, was absorbed by algae, concentrated inside the fish that ate that algae, and then concentrated again inside the eagles that ate those fish. By the 1960s, DDT levels inside American apex predators were high enough to thin their eggshells to the point that the eggs collapsed under the simple weight of the mother sitting on them. Nesting pairs of bald eagles in the lower states dropped to under 1,000 before the chemical was finally banned in the early 1970s. That is what an entire lifetime spent at the top of a food chain does to living tissue, whether the toxin is mercury, lead, or a pesticide sprayed decades earlier by people who had no idea where it would eventually end up. A similar mercury poisoning event unfolded around the middle of the last century in a Japanese coastal community, where industrial wastewater discharged directly into a bay worked its way up through shellfish and fish before concentrating inside the local population that depended on seafood at the top of that same short chain, causing severe and permanent neurological damage in thousands of people. The lesson from both disasters lands in the exact same place, decades apart, on opposite sides of the planet, involving completely different toxins and completely different animals. The higher up a food chain you eat, the more of everyone else's accumulated pollution ends up sitting on your own plate. Bald eagles, for what it is worth, eventually did recover once DDT was pulled from the market. Removed from the endangered species list decades later, proof that the underlying chemistry can be reversed once the source of the poison is finally cut off. None of this danger is some recent scientific discovery either. Arctic explorers learned this the hard way well over a century ago. Sled dogs across the far north have known, apparently through pure instinct, never to touch polar bear liver. Human expedition crews in the early 1900s never got that particular memo. Members of one especially grueling Antarctic expedition ate husky liver out of sheer desperation and came down with violent headaches, peeling skin, and eventual organ failure. Doctors later identified the cause as hypervitaminosis A, extreme vitamin A poisoning, a diagnosis that took years to fully piece together from a handful of scattered, near-fatal cases across different expeditions. Polar bear and husky liver store such an absurd concentration of vitamin A that a single serving can be fatal to a human body. Indigenous Arctic communities had understood to avoid it for generations, long before modern science ever caught up with a name for why. The concentration involved is not subtle either. A serving of polar bear liver can carry enough stored vitamin A to overwhelm a human liver many times over, an amount that would take years of ordinary dietary supplementation to accumulate through any conventional source. It is a striking illustration of the same underlying principle running through this entire topic. Whatever a predator has been quietly storing across its lifetime, in its liver, its fat, its muscle tissue, gets handed directly to whoever eats it next, concentrated rather than diluted. There is also the naturally low head count problem sitting underneath all of this, separate from the raw energy math but pointing at the exact same conclusion. Apex predators are rare on any real landscape, almost by definition. A healthy patch of wilderness might support hundreds of deer, dozens of coyotes, and only a small handful of wolves at the very top, because that is simply how much predator biomass the ecosystem underneath can physically sustain at once, no matter how favorable the conditions happen to be. There was never a large enough natural breeding population of any major predator species sitting around waiting to be domesticated in the first place. You cannot build a stable, generations-deep farming operation out of an animal that was already scarce on the landscape before anyone ever tried to pen it in. Compare that natural ratio to cattle. where a single healthy pasture can support dozens of cows grazing side by side without exhausting the grass beneath them season after season. Nature never handed early farmers a comparable starting stock of predators to work with. No dense wild population of lions or wolves clustered densely enough in one place to make domestication a remotely realistic starting point, the way it was for cattle, sheep, or goats. Then there is what predator meat actually becomes, physically, long before it ever reaches a plate. Prey animals spend most of their time grazing calmly. Predators sprint, stalk, and fight hard for every single meal they manage to catch. That kind of constant physical stress floods their muscles with cortisol and adrenaline, and it burns through the glycogen that normally keeps meat tender when an animal is relaxed at the moment of slaughter. What is left behind is meat that runs tougher, gamier, and often carries a strong, musky flavor from testosterone linked compounds concentrated deep in the tissue. Hunters who have genuinely eaten mountain lion or wolf tend to describe it the exact same way almost every time. Edible in a true survival situation. Never something you would willingly choose off a menu. The comparison people reach for most often is old, working farm animal versus young, pampered feedlot animal, except pushed to a much further extreme. A predator has effectively spent its entire life training for competitive sport, sprinting, wrestling, going hungry for days between successful hunts, and meat from an animal that lived that way behaves nothing like meat from an animal that spent its life standing calmly in a pasture. And then there is disease. Predators eat the sick, the old, and the weakest animals in any given population, which means they are also eating whatever parasites and pathogens those animals happen to be carrying. Trichinosis, a genuinely dangerous parasitic infection once common in undercooked bear and wild boar meat, spreads specifically through predator and scavenger flesh. Wildlife biologists have long flagged carnivore meat as carrying a dramatically higher parasite load than herbivore meat for exactly this reason. A predator is not simply eating flesh. It is eating everything that was already wrong with whatever it caught: weakness, injury, infection, and whatever organisms had already taken up residence inside that weaker animal before the predator ever got involved. All of it passed forward, layer by layer, to whoever eats the predator next. There is an even stranger disease risk buried in this same category, one involving a class of infectious agents that are not even technically alive. Prions are misfolded proteins capable of triggering nearby proteins to misfold in the exact same way, slowly destroying brain tissue over months or years with no cure and no known treatment. One of the most devastating documented outbreaks of prion disease in human history occurred among a population in Papua New Guinea that practiced a funerary ritual involving consumption of a deceased relative's tissue, including brain tissue, as an act of mourning and respect. The resulting illness, known as kuru, spread specifically through that practice, causing tremors, loss of coordination, and eventual death. And it was eventually traced, studied, and understood well enough to earn its researchers a Nobel Prize decades later. It stands as one of the clearest human demonstrations that eating tissue positioned at the very top of a chain, including nervous tissue specifically, carries a genuinely unique category of risk that plant-based and herbivore diets simply do not carry in anything close to the same way. Prions offer their own uncomfortable warning about what happens when farming practices accidentally recreate a predator's diet inside an animal that was never supposed to eat that way at all. In the 1980s and 90s, cattle in parts of Europe were fed rendered protein supplements that included tissue from other cattle, effectively turning naturally herbivorous animals into unintentional carnivores, and in some documented cases, unintentional cannibals. The result was an outbreak of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, widely known as mad cow disease, a prion illness that devastated herds across an entire region and, in a small number of tragic human cases, crossed over into people who had eaten affected beef. The entire disaster amounted to humans briefly, accidentally, forcing a grazing animal to eat like something at the top of the food chain, and the food chain punished that mistake almost immediately and without mercy. Now, the rule is not completely absolute, and the exceptions actually reinforce it rather than break it. Bear meat has been eaten in parts of Scandinavia, Russia, and North America for generations, but almost always in small quantities, almost always cooked until thoroughly done, and almost always treated as an occasional specialty rather than a dietary staple. Lion meat has occasionally been consumed in parts of Africa during severe famine, when starving communities genuinely had no safer alternative left and every ordinary food source had already failed them. In nearly every documented case throughout recorded history, humans only turned to predator meat once every safer, cheaper, plant-based option had already been exhausted. That is not a counterexample. That is the rule proving itself. Predator meat has always functioned as a last resort, never a first choice, the culinary equivalent of a break glass in case of emergency option rather than something any stable, well-fed society ever built a genuine food system around. There is one genuinely modern exception worth mentioning, and it is a distinctly American one. Alligator farming is a real, legal, commercially viable industry across the Gulf Coast, and alligators are unquestionably apex predators. What makes this exception work, where lion or wolf farming never could, comes down to basic biology. Alligators are cold-blooded, which means they do not burn enormous amounts of energy, simply maintaining a constant internal body temperature the way a wolf or a lion has to. A far greater share of whatever an alligator eats gets converted directly into body mass, instead of being spent keeping its own furnace running. That single metabolic difference is enough to make farming a genuine predator economically viable in a way that has never once worked for any warm-blooded carnivore. Alligator meat and hides now support a legitimate industry across Louisiana and Florida, complete with regulated farms, harvest quotas, and a restaurant market willing to pay for it, something no lion or wolf farming operation has ever managed to build, outside of extreme desperation or the narrow bone trade already mentioned. The exception that finally works is the one that quietly sidesteps the entire energy problem in the first place, by starting with an animal that was never burning most of its calories just to stay warm. South Africa also runs a legal, deeply controversial lion farming operation, though it exists almost entirely to supply lion bones into traditional medicine markets overseas rather than to put lion meat onto anyone's dinner plate. Thousands of lions live out their entire lives on these farms without ever once being marketed as a food source, bred, raised, and eventually slaughtered specifically for their skeletons. Conservation groups have condemned the practice for years, and it remains one of the only serious large-scale attempts anywhere on the planet to farm a major predator at any real scale. The fact that it stays controversial, tightly restricted, and aimed squarely at bones instead of meat only underlines how thoroughly the rest of the world has avoided that particular road entirely. Somewhere along the way, culture caught up with biology and made the whole arrangement official. The dietary laws recorded in Leviticus explicitly forbid eating birds of prey and clawed carnivores, naming eagles, vultures, and hawks by name. Islamic dietary law draws essentially the identical line, prohibiting animals that hunt using fangs or talons, a restriction observed across enormously different regions and languages that otherwise share very little cultural overlap with each other. Across civilizations with zero contact with one another, from the ancient Near East to the Arabian Peninsula to indigenous hunting traditions across North America, the same invisible boundary kept reappearing again and again, entirely independently of one another. Eat the grazer, spare the hunter. Totemic traditions across entirely separate hunter-gatherer societies frequently designated a specific predator species as an ancestral guardian or clan symbol, placing it entirely off limits at mealtime regardless of whether it would have been safe or practical to eat in the first place. Some anthropologists argue this was never purely a matter of safety either. Predators were also feared, respected, and in a great many cultures actively worshipped, and you generally do not eat the animal you have built a religion around. You do not eat the creature whose skull decorates your chief's headdress, or whose carved likeness guards the entrance to your temple. Across dozens of unrelated civilizations, the lion, the eagle, the wolf, and the bear kept resurfacing again and again as symbols of power, sovereignty, and divinity. National flags, royal crests, and military insignia across entirely different continents leaned on the exact same small handful of apex predators to represent strength and authority. Never a sheep, never a cow, always the animal sitting at the top. It is difficult to serve dinner out of a god, and harder still, to build an entire farming industry around slaughtering the very creature your own culture chose to represent everything it aspired to be. So the real answer was never one single thing. It is biology stacking on top of chemistry, stacking on top of scarcity, stacking on top of culture, all pointing toward the exact same conclusion from four completely different directions. Predator meat costs too much energy to produce in the first place. It concentrates too much accumulated toxin over a lifetime. It tastes worse and breaks down worse on the plate. It carries a meaningfully higher disease burden, prions included. And on top of every one of those practical problems, we spent thousands of years quietly turning the animals sitting at the top of the food chain into symbols instead of meals. Every ecosystem on this planet, from a coral reef to a boreal forest to a stretch of open grassland, runs on the exact same quiet arithmetic. Energy moves upward, and less of it survives the climb at every single step along the way. Humans did not invent the rule that predators do not end up on the dinner table. We simply kept noticing it, over and over, in every unconnected corner of the world, and we built our plates around what the math had already decided a long time before any of us ever showed up to argue about it. Every unrelated culture that ever sat down and tried to answer the question of what is safe, efficient, and worth the effort to eat arrived at the same quiet verdict, without a single one of them ever comparing notes. The wolf was never on the menu. The math decided that a very long time ago, and biology, chemistry, and culture have all been quietly agreeing with it ever since.